No, FNAF 2 did not have good gameplay. Does that mean it's a bad game? No. Chances are you're questioning my nerve to come forward in a fanbase where an individual's negative thoughts on a FNAF game has the same weight as a flat earther argument. But I have noticed a massive shift in people's thoughts on FNAF 2 lately. The same game that was many people's favorites in the franchise is now becoming one of people's least favorites. That includes me. FNAF 2 has so many flaws that I have to narrow things down to only the major problems that reduce the fun factor. And I still have a lot to say. Sitting and monitoring the enemies through cameras wasn't something many people thought of back in 2014. FNAF 1 was so different that the players' expectations of horror games didn't carry over, and therefore the fear of uncertainty came back. Eventually though, the novelty of cameras wears off, and you notice how in a game with 10 cameras, you really need only one of them. In fact, you must stop using cameras in order to complete the game. FNAF 2 is no better. This time, you have 12 cameras that you are discouraged from using. Much like in the first game, you may spend the first night or so using the cameras in order to explore the environment, but eventually you have to reserve time and resources for surviving the encounters instead. Keeping track of the enemies using cameras is a super exciting idea that the game fails to make use of because of many mechanics that work against the camera system. The result is a super repetitive game loop where the only things you do are using the mask, checking the vents, and winding up the music box. A cycle that lasts for 7 minutes if you beat the night. But FNAF 2 is challenging, so you're going to spend way more than 7 minutes repeating this cycle for each night. There is a mechanic where if you shine the flashlight as the animatronics, excluding Balloon Boy, they are going to be stalled for several seconds before they try moving again. You may argue that this makes the cameras useful, but we have seen many people beating the game without this mechanic. In fact, some people don't even know it exists. So as a matter of fact, in a game with 12 cameras, you only need a single one of them. People never talk about this because it's completely normalized both in the case of FNAF and its fan games, but I don't think you realize how much this really stings as a developer. When we talk about 11 useless cameras, we talk about modeling and detailing so many different rooms that the player doesn't even need to use in the end. They look at them once and then forget about them entirely. In the case of official FNAF games, you have the theorists who analyze every single pixel of the game's sprites, including the cameras, but a huge portion of fan games don't have a matpat investigating them. Besides, that's only if you care about the game's narrative, and if you want to be able to beat the game in the first place, you have to ditch them all. If you're adding cameras to your game, you should actually make use of it. Otherwise, save yourself a lot of time by removing them and reserving space for mechanics that the player actually has to use. Now let's put the cameras aside and talk about another problem that FNAF 2 deals with. If you were to ask what people like the most about FNAF 2, one of their answers would be the cast. You have the toy animatronics, the puppets, the withered animatronics, and the one and only Golden Freddy. A big roster that we've got here. In terms of lore, FNAF 2 was like going to Disneyland thanks to how many characters it had for people to analyze. But we are discussing gameplay here. Gameplay wise, things aren't as exciting. So we have 11 main characters to counter in this game. One is the puppet whose music box you have to wind up. Then there is Withered Foxy who you have to flash in the hallway. The other 9? Wear the mask. Having enemies behave the same way makes them become fillers. The withered and toy casts appearing once in the office is the same as the toy cast appearing twice. Notice how the only reason that you need the flashlights in this game is Withered Foxy being one of the only 2 characters that are countered differently. There was room for many ways to make the characters behave differently in order to make the strategies a lot more varied. What you get instead is the same ice cream under 9 different brands. These enemies could also be used to make the cameras actually have a use. A lot of them are countered only when they enter the office. What if the withered cast, for example, had to be avoided from entering the office, and in order to do that, you have to use the cameras? Enemies make a huge impact on how the game plays out, but if you have extra enemies whose behavior has little to no difference, then scrap them. You could easily have the withered cast stay in the room and not change much. And if you want the game to be hard, just make the remaining enemies more aggressive instead. The music box. Arguably one of the most infamous mechanics in the history of FNAF, for a good reason. As you enter the 3rd or later night, the durability of the music box is reduced to the point where you have to focus only on camera 11 in order to wind up the music box constantly. The first problem, as you can guess, is that it discourages you from using any of the other cameras. If you bother using the other cameras, then you won't have enough time to wind it up. Don't forget that lots of animatronics may enter your office at any moment and stay for several seconds. It is such an unfun mechanic too. Just hold down a button. Pure busy work. The puppet, besides being a very iconic character in the franchise, is merely a bandage fix for the problem of cameras not having a use. Because cameras are already useless, but if you were to remove the music box, then you don't even need to pull the panel up. This mechanic has been used a lot in fan games and oftentimes they are no better. Sometimes you may see some of them pulling a few twists in order to make the music box more interesting. The return to Freddy's rebuild, for example, makes the puppet move through the cameras and therefore the position of the music box changes with it. But it does nothing else to address the bigger problems. If you want a puppet-like character in your game, you have to change the music box entirely, to the point that it's no longer even the same mechanic. A music box should not be just holding down a button and an excuse to pull the camera panel up. Instead of forcing the player to use the camera panel, make them actually need the cameras. So, now that we have wrapped up most of the major flaws with the cameras, I want to take a step back and talk about another problem that also takes a huge toll on this game. Let's talk about pacing. To make a game enjoyable for the player to complete, you have to design the pacing in a way that it is neither too challenging nor too easy. If the game is too hard compared to how much progress you make, the player will be frustrated. The other way around, the player will be bored. FNAF 2 is a very interesting case when it comes to pacing. On the first half, it can be very frustrating, yet on the second half, despite the increased difficulty, the game can be very boring too. Most of us have the perception that the more action a game has, the more fun it is. I used to believe the same thing, but nowadays this statement makes me cry. Action is a subjective matter. Not everyone wants to play a fast-paced and action-packed game. A very good example of it being players of strategy games like chess. But you're not playing FNAF for a chess match with William Afton. Even then, another problem is that action has a limit. There should be variety in your game's tension because just as much as you want to avoid the players getting bored, you also want to avoid them getting exhausted by too much of it, which is where FNAF 2 fails. Just a few nights in, you start to have an encounter in the office time to time, and it might be fun for a while, but then it becomes every few seconds. You can't catch any breath and it feels very annoying, and you go through this cycle for so long that eventually you become insensitive to it all, and therefore bored. At this point, the only people possibly having fun and willing to beat the game are completionists. In fact, most of the people who I talk to have never beat FNAF 2. I myself have never beat FNAF 2 either. The highest I ever got to was Night 4. Because there is so much that happens on repeat in the game that I feel intimidated to even play it. Because I don't want to hold down the left mouse button and then swing the cursor over a few buttons on repeat for 7 fucking minutes. And finally, this incredibly high level of action takes a toll on the jump scares too. Because of the many times that you get jump scared in this game, you start to become desensitized and they become very ineffective. This is quite the opposite of what FNAF 1 tried to accomplish with its slower pacing. The game had more focus on the feeling of anticipating the jump scares, and therefore their delivery was often much stronger. No wonder that I've seen more people beating the first game. It's not just that FNAF 1 may be easier in comparison, it's also far less exhausting to play than FNAF 2. Maybe you think that I'm not a true FNAF fan for not beating the second game, or even thinking that it doesn't have a good gameplay. But hey, I don't care. The list of problems in FNAF 2 is a lot longer than I'm willing to cover. There is still a lot that I haven't discussed, like the phone calls, the heavily RNG and unbalanced nature, and so on. Still, it's worth acknowledging the contribution that FNAF 2 has made to the franchise. It mainly comes in the form of narrative, where there is a lot for the fans to love. You have the main characters and Easter egg ones like Shadow, Freddy and Bonnie, the death minigames, the cutscenes, and so on. The game is packed with so many narrative bits and details that even after over a decade, people still search for new ones and form new theories. This means that the fans of the entry should be even more glad that the film adaptation is right around the corner. Gameplay is not a concern and they can spend all their resources on the plot, designs, and world building. Even if the case of the gameplay is lost, the film helps the game play to its strength. The fans should celebrate. If FNAF 2 were to fail, then you wouldn't have over 10 official games, novels, film adaptations, and most importantly to me, the enormous and rapidly growing sub-community of fan games. So indeed, despite its horrible gameplay, I'm glad FNAF 2 was made, because I don't think any of this would have ever happened without it. But wait, what about the fan games? People always talk about their fantasies of making their own take on the FNAF 2 gameplay, and then their game is the same thing but with new graphics. Never change. Not all hope is lost though, especially after I went through some of the more promising remakes and found one that was far better than I expected. We have seen very decent FNAF 2 remakes lately. One of them was Fistloom's remake, which was really polished and detailed, and now you also have FNAF Rewritten 87, which has a lot to offer in terms of presentation. But in terms of gameplay, FNAF 2 Reimagined beats them all. So what does this remake address? You no longer have the music box. You no longer have too many enemies of the same type. The withered elements running work differently, and you also use at least half the cameras. The icing on the cake? The RNG is much more controlled here, and the game feels far less overwhelming to play, as it gives you time to react to each character who demands a different action. Now, the game is by no means perfect. It still has a bunch of useless cameras. The fuse box mechanic adds no depth to the gameplay, and you don't need to do anything other than wearing the mask in the first night. But in the end, while we don't have a perfect FNAF 2 remake, this game gets more than close enough to the point that I can easily call it a good substitute. This game shows why it matters to sometimes ignore the original game if it's beneficial. Sometimes you have to sacrifice some of the source material if it results in a better experience. In fact, this is one of the biggest problems with most fan games. Many times we forcefully add or do a certain thing for our games solely for the sake of following conventions, yet all they do is only make the game worse. So if your goal is to make an actually good game, you have to acknowledge the mistakes that the official games make and try to avoid them instead of repeating them just because they're expected. This doesn't apply to remakes only, but any fan game. And there you have it. All the big problems with the gameplay of FNAF 2, why the game still matters anyway, and yeah, the fact that the better FNAF 2 happens to be on Roblox of all places. Maybe this will be a lesson not to underestimate the games people make on Roblox next time. Sometimes. Thanks for watching.